Imagine a world where your daily grind hides a thrilling underbelly. My nights as a dishwasher in a sleepy Florida diner were anything but ordinary, and the things I saw and heard between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. would shock you. Get ready, because I'm about to expose the midnight secrets no one else dares to speak of. My name is Jake, and 3 months ago, I took what seemed like the most ordinary job in the world, washing dishes at Ruby's all-night diner on Highway 27, just outside Claremont. The pay was decent for Florida, $15 an hour, and the night shift differential meant I could actually afford my rent without having 3 roommates. What they didn't mention in the job posting was that Ruby's wasn't just any diner. It was a place where the normal rules of reality seemed to bend after midnight, and where keeping your job meant following instructions that would make most people question their sanity. The first thing that struck me about Ruby's was how different it felt once the last customer left around 11:30 p.m. During the day, it was your typical roadside diner. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and the constant chatter of truckers, tourists, and locals grabbing quick meals. The jukebox played classic rock, coffee cups clinked against saucers, and everything felt alive with that familiar diner energy. But when the neon open sign flickered off and the front door locked with that heavy click, it was like someone had suddenly drained all the warmth from the building. The silence hit first, not the comfortable quiet you might expect in an empty restaurant, but an oppressive, almost hungry silence that seemed to press against your eardrums. The fluorescent lights hummed with a different frequency, casting harsh shadows that hadn't been there during the day. Even the air felt thicker, carrying scents that lingered long after their sources had been cleaned away. Old grease, stale cigarettes from decades past, and something else I could never quite identify, something metallic and slightly sweet. My workspace was the dish pit, a cramped area behind the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. The industrial dishwasher was a hulking beast of stainless steel and rubber seals, constantly dripping and hissing like some mechanical dragon. The floors were permanently stained with years of grease and food particles, despite my nightly mopping. Stacks of plates, glasses, and silverware surrounded me like walls of a ceramic fortress, and the whole area reeked of industrial sanitizer mixed with decades of absorbed cooking odors. But it was the little details that made my skin crawl. The way certain tiles on the floor felt loose under my feet, as if something was shifting beneath them. The persistent drip from a pipe that maintenance could never seem to find, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. The storage shelves that groaned and settled throughout the night, even though no one was touching them. And then there were the stains on the walls, dark patches that seemed to grow larger each night, despite my attempts to scrub them clean. Maria, the night manager, was a weathered woman in her 50s who had worked at Ruby's for over 20 years. She had deep lines around her eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she spoke with a slight accent that suggested roots somewhere in the Caribbean. During my first week, she seemed normal enough, efficient, businesslike, concerned mainly with making sure everything was clean and ready for the morning shift. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at me, a kind of knowing sadness that made me uncomfortable. It was Trevor, the fry cook, who first mentioned the rules. Trevor was a thin, nervous man in his 30s who had been working nights at Ruby's for about 2 years. He had pale skin that seemed to have never seen sunlight, and his hand shook slightly whenever he wasn't actively cooking. On my third night, as I was scraping plates around 1 a.m., he approached my station with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Jake," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure Maria wasn't within earshot, "there are some things you need to know about working here. Things Maria won't tell you directly, but things that are important." I laughed, thinking he was about to share some typical workplace gossip or maybe complain about management. "What kind of things?" Trevor's face remained serious. "Rules. Specific rules for the night shift. Rules that keep us safe." He paused, running a hand through his greasy hair. "Look, I know it sounds crazy, but the last guy who worked your position, he didn't follow the rules. And now he's gone. Gone. Like he quit." "Gone," Trevor repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "As in, no one has seen him since his last shift. His car was found in the parking lot the next morning. He's still in the ignition, engine running. Police said it was like he just vanished into thin air." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to maintain my skepticism. Come on, man. People don't just disappear. He probably had personal problems. Maybe ran off with some girl or skipped town to avoid debt collectors. Trevor shook his head firmly. His name was Danny Rivera. He had a wife and 2 kids. He wasn't the type to just abandon his family. And besides, he glanced around again, then leaned closer. The security footage from that night was corrupted. All of it. 6 hours of video, completely scrambled. The police said they'd never seen anything like it. The way Trevor spoke, with such conviction and fear in his voice, made it impossible to dismiss his words entirely. There was something about the diner at night that felt wrong, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up during quiet moments. Maybe it was just the isolation or the strange acoustics of the empty building, but I found myself believing there might be more to his story than simple paranoia. What kind of rules? I asked, surprised by how quiet my own voice had become. Trevor pulled a folded piece of paper from his apron pocket and handed it to me. It was worn and stained, as if it had been handled many times. Danny wrote these down during his first week. He gave them to me before whatever happened to him. I've been following them ever since, and I'm still here. I unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone under stress, and some of the ink had smudged. At the top, in block letters, were the words, "Night Shift Survival Guide, Ruby's Diner." Below there was a numbered list that made my blood run cold. But before I could read the full list, Maria's voice cut through the kitchen. "Trevor, orders up." The sound made both of us jump, and Trevor quickly snatched the paper back. "Read it later," he whispered urgently, "when you're alone." And Jake, he gripped my shoulder with surprising strength. "Follow every rule, no matter how stupid it seems. Your life might depend on it." As Trevor hurried back to his station, I noticed that the temperature in the kitchen seemed to have dropped several degrees. The dish machine's hissing sounded different too, almost like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. I shook my head, trying to focus on the simple task of washing dishes, but Trevor's words kept echoing in my mind. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows beyond the kitchen lights. Every sound seemed amplified. The clatter of dishes, the splash of water, the mechanical groaning of the old building settling. By the time 6 a.m. arrived and the morning crew began filtering in, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. As I clocked out and stepped into the Florida dawn, the warmth of the early morning sun felt like a blessing. The world outside Ruby's seemed normal again. Birds chirping, traffic beginning to build on Highway 27, the smell of fresh air replacing the oppressive atmosphere of the diner. But even as I drove home to my small apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about Trevor's terrified expression and the mysterious rules written on that worn piece of paper. What had really happened to Danny Rivera? And what kind of rules could possibly be necessary for washing dishes in a roadside diner? As I tried to sleep in my darkened bedroom, with blackout curtains blocking the Florida sunshine, I realized that my second night at Ruby's couldn't come soon enough. I needed to see that list again, and I needed to understand what I had gotten myself into. But deep down, in a part of my mind I tried to ignore, I suspected that some knowledge comes with a price that might be too high to pay. The next evening, I arrived at Ruby's 30 minutes early, my mind still churning with questions from the previous night. The diner looked exactly the same as always. Neon lights flickering in the humid Florida evening, a handful of customers finishing late dinners, the familiar sounds of sizzling food and clinking silverware. But now I noticed things I had missed before. The way certain customers seemed to avoid eye contact with the staff. How some of the regulars would glance nervously at the clock as it approached 11 p.m., quickly finishing their meals and leaving generous tips before hurrying out to their cars. Maria was behind the counter when I walked in, reviewing receipts with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. She looked up as I approached, and I caught that same expression Trevor had mentioned, a kind of weary knowledge that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. "Early tonight, Jake," she observed, not quite making a question. "Couldn't sleep," I replied honestly. "Still adjusting to the schedule, I guess." She nodded slowly, then set down her paperwork and really looked at me for the first time since I started working there. "Trevor spoke to you last night." It wasn't a question, and the directness of it caught me off guard. He mentioned some workplace guidelines. Maria's laugh was short and bitter. Guidelines. Yes, that's one way to put it. She glanced around the diner, ensuring the remaining customers were out of earshot, then gestured for me to follow her to the back office. The office was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets, old menus, and decades of accumulated paperwork. A small desk sat wedged between two walls, covered with invoices and schedules. Maria closed the door behind us and turned to face me with an expression that was both resigned and sympathetic. "How long have you been working nights, Jake?" she asked. "This is my 4th night, and you haven't experienced anything unusual yet." The way she asked made my stomach tighten. Define unusual. Maria sat down heavily in a desk chair, suddenly looking far older than her years. "I've been the night manager here for 21 years. In that time, I've seen 14 different dishwashers come and go. Some quit after their first week, claiming the job was too stressful or the hours too difficult. Others lasted longer, sometimes months, before they decided they'd had enough." She paused, opening a drawer and pulling out a worn manila folder. But three of them simply disappeared. No notice, no goodbye, no forwarding address. They just stopped showing up for work, and when we investigated, it was as if they had never existed at all. My mouth felt dry. What happened to them? "I don't know," Maria admitted, her voice heavy with years of guilt and frustration. "But I know what happened the nights before they vanished. They broke the rules." She opened the folder and spread several pieces of paper across the desk. I recognized Danny Rivera's handwriting from the night before, but there were other documents as well. Photocopies of similar lists written in different hands, all with the same desperate urgency. "These rules weren't created by management," Maria explained. "They were discovered by the dishwashers themselves, through trial and error, through fear. Each person who worked your position added to the list, refining it, making it more specific. Danny Rivera was particularly thorough in documenting everything he observed." I picked up the top sheet, my hands trembling slightly. The list was longer than I had expected, written in Danny's shaky handwriting. "Night Shift Survival Guide, Ruby's Diner. 1. Never work alone in the dish pit between 2:17 a.m. and 2:23 a.m. If you must be there during this time, keep the radio playing and talk to yourself continuously. The silence during these 6 minutes can be dangerous. 2. If you hear your name called from the dining room after midnight, do not respond. Do not go to investigate. Continue working and pretend you heard nothing. 3. The walk-in freezer door will sometimes open on its own. Close it immediately, but never look inside when this happens. If you see something moving in the darkness, run. 4. When washing the coffee cups, count them carefully. There should never be more than 47. If you count 48, immediately break the extra cup and throw the pieces in the dumpster outside. 5. The dish machine will occasionally run by itself, even when empty. Let it finish its cycle. Never open it while it's running during these times. 6. If the lights in the dining room start flickering in a pattern, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Turn off all electrical equipment in the kitchen and wait in the parking lot until it stops. 7. Never clean table 7 after midnight, even if it appears dirty. If a customer sits there during your shift, serve them normally but clean the table before your shift ends, never during. 8. The phone in the kitchen will sometimes ring with no one on the other end. Answer it normally. Say, "Ruby's Diner, we're closed," then hang up. Never answer it a second time. If it rings again, immediately. 9. If you find dishes that are already clean in the dirty dish tubs, wash them again without question. Count how many there are and tell Maria in the morning. 10. The back door to the alley must be checked every hour, but never between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. If you find it open during your hourly checks, close it and prop a chair against it. The list continued for another dozen items, each more bizarre than the last. As I read, I felt a growing sense of unreality, as if I had stumbled into some elaborate practical joke. But Maria's expression remained deadly serious, and the careful, frightened handwriting of multiple people suggested this was anything but a joke. "This is insane," I whispered, looking up at her. "These can't be real rules. This sounds like some kind of supernatural nonsense." Maria leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving my face. I thought the same thing when the first dishwasher showed me his list. That was 15 years ago. His name was Miguel Santos, and he was convinced the diner was haunted. I laughed at him, told him he was letting the isolation get to him. What changed your mind? Miguel disappeared on a Tuesday night in March. The security cameras captured him, working normally, until 2:15 a.m. Then, for exactly 6 minutes, the footage went black. When he came back online, he was gone. His apron was still hanging on the hook. Dishes were half washed in the sink, but Miguel was nowhere to be found. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing the dish pit exactly as she described. Everything looked normal except for the absence of the person who should have been there. The police investigated, of course. They found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication that Miguel had left voluntarily. His car keys were still in his pocket, which we found on the floor next to the dish machine. But Miguel himself had simply vanished. I stared at the photograph, tried to process what I was seeing. What about the other two? Kevin Morrison, 4 years later. Same circumstances, same 6-minute blackout on the security footage. And then Danny Rivera, just 3 months ago. Maria's voice became quieter. Danny was different, though. He was methodical, scientific almost. He started documenting everything he observed, trying to find patterns, trying to understand what was happening in this place after midnight. Did he find anything? Maria nodded slowly. He theorized that Ruby's Diner sits on what he called a thin place, a location where the boundary between our world and something else becomes permeable during certain hours. He believed the rules weren't arbitrary restrictions, but rather a kind of protection protocol, ways to avoid triggering whatever exists in that other realm. I felt a chill despite the warm Florida air, seeping through the office's poor insulation. You believe him? I believe in survival, Jake. I believe in the fact that every dishwasher who followed these rules exactly has completed their shifts safely. And I believe in the fact that everyone who ignored them has disappeared without a trace. She gathered the papers back into the folder and handed it to me. Take this home tonight. Study it carefully. Memorize every rule. And tomorrow night, when you start your shift, follow them precisely, no matter how ridiculous they seem. As I took the folder, our fingers touched briefly, and I was surprised by how cold her hands were. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not cut out for whatever this job really requires? Maria stood up and opened the office door, signaling that our conversation was over. Then quit now, tonight, before you start your next shift. Go home, call in the morning, and tell me you won't be returning. I'll understand completely, and I won't think less of you for it. She paused in the doorway, her hand on the light switch. But if you decide to stay, Jake, if you decide to keep working here, then commit to following every rule completely. Because in this job, there are no second chances. The diner doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't give warnings. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I went through the motions of my shift, washing dishes and cleaning equipment, but my mind was entirely focused on the folder tucked safely in my car. Every sound seemed potentially significant. Every shadow might be hiding something dangerous. When Trevor asked me how I was doing, I could only nod and mumble something about being tired. By 6 a.m., when the morning crew arrived and I was finally able to clock out, I felt like I had been holding my breath for 6 hours. The Florida sunrise had never looked so beautiful, and the normal sounds of early morning traffic seemed like a symphony of reassurance. But as I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, I realized that I had already made my decision. Despite every rational instinct telling me to quit, despite the fear that was already taking root in my stomach, I knew I would be back the next night. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was simple stubbornness, but I needed to know if the rules were real. I needed to understand what had happened to Danny Rivera and the others. And most of all, I needed to prove to myself that I was brave enough to face whatever lurked in the darkness of Ruby's all-night diner. That afternoon, as I lay in my darkened bedroom trying to sleep, I studied Danny's rules until I had memorized every word. But memorizing them was the easy part. The real challenge would come that night, when I would have to decide whether I truly believed in them enough to stake my life on their accuracy. My 5th night at Ruby's began like all the others, but now I saw everything through the lens of Danny Rivera's rules. As the last customer left at 11:45 p.m. and Maria locked the front door, I felt a familiar transformation of the diner from a normal restaurant into something else entirely. But this time, instead of simply feeling uneasy, I was hyper-aware of every detail, every sound, every movement that might signal the beginning of something supernatural. I'd spent the previous day memorizing the rules until I could recite them backwards. More than that, I had started to notice things that lent credence to their bizarre specificity. The coffee cups, for instance. During my dinner rush prep, I had counted them carefully, exactly 47, just as a rule specified. The walk-in freezer door had a slight warp in the frame that made it swing open, if not properly latched. And table 7, which I had never paid attention to before, sat in a corner where the lighting was dimmer than the rest of the dining room, creating shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Trevor noticed my increased attentiveness immediately. As I began setting up my station for the night, he approached with an expression that mixed relief and concern. "You read them," he said quietly, not needing to specify what he meant. "I read them. I memorized them. But Trevor," I paused, checking to make sure Maria was out of earshot in her office. "I still don't understand what I'm supposed to be protecting myself from." Trevor glanced around nervously, then moved closer to my workstation. "You'll start to understand tonight. The 5th night is usually when things begin to manifest more clearly. It's like the diner is testing you, seeing if you're going to be a problem or if you're going to follow the rules like you're supposed to." "What kind of manifestations?" Before Trevor could answer, the lights throughout the diner flickered once, briefly, then returned to their normal harsh fluorescent glow. We both froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "That's not the pattern from Rule 6, I whispered, checking my mental list. "No," Trevor agreed, visibly relaxing. "That's just old wiring. You'll learn to tell the difference." As if to prove his point, the lights flickered again, but this time in a clear, deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long ones, 3 short again. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the sequence from the rules. "Rule 6, I breathed, already moving toward the electrical panel. Trevor was right behind me. "Turn off everything. Now." We quickly shut down all the kitchen equipment, the dish machine, the fryers, the grills, even the coffee makers. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units that we dared not disconnect. Through the pass-through window, we could see the dining room lights continuing their ominous pattern, casting strobing shadows across the empty tables and booths. "How long does this usually last?" I asked, already heading for the back door. "Anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour," Trevor replied, grabbing his cigarettes from his apron pocket. We wait outside until it stops. The parking lot behind Ruby's was small and poorly lit, surrounded by palmetto scrub and the kind of scraggly Florida vegetation that thrived in roadside locations. The air was thick with humidity and the ever-present scent of the nearby swampland. Under normal circumstances, it would have felt peaceful, even pleasant. But knowing that we had been driven from our workplace by some inexplicable electrical phenomenon made the darkness seem threatening rather than calming. We stood near my car, watching the windows of the diner flash like a lighthouse gone mad. The pattern never varied. Always 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, with precise timing between each sequence. "Trevor," I said after several minutes of silence, "what exactly is in there?" He took a long drag from his cigarette before answering. Danny had theories. He thought maybe it was residual energy from something traumatic that happened here years ago. Or maybe the diner was built on some kind of sacred ground that doesn't appreciate being covered with linoleum and vinyl booths. "But you don't believe that?" Trevor shook his head. "I think it's something that feeds on the night shift workers. Something that needs the isolation and the darkness to fully manifest. And I think the rules aren't just protection. They're like a peace treaty. As long as we follow them exactly, it leaves us alone." "What happens if someone breaks a rule?" "I don't know for sure, because anyone who's broken a major rule has disappeared completely. But I've made small mistakes before, minor violations, and..." He rolled up his sleeve to show me his left arm. In the dim light from the parking lot lamp, I could see what looked like 5 parallel scars running from his wrist to his elbow, as if something with claws had raked across his skin. "Jesus Christ, Trevor. What happened?" 6 months ago, I answered the kitchen phone twice in a row during one of those calls with no one on the line. Violated Rule 8. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on the floor of the dish pit with these marks and no memory of how I got them. He pulled his sleeve back down. Maria found me when she came to check why I hadn't responded to her radio calls. The security footage for that hour was corrupted, just like always. The lights inside Ruby's suddenly stopped flashing and returned to their normal steady glow. We waited another few minutes to be sure, then cautiously returned to the building. Everything appeared normal. No overturned furniture, no broken dishes, no signs that anything unusual had occurred. But there was a smell in the air that hadn't been there before, something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. As we restarted the kitchen equipment and returned to our normal duties, I found myself checking the clock obsessively. It was approaching 1 a.m., which meant I was entering the most dangerous hours of the night shift. According to the rules, this was when the really serious phenomena began to manifest. I was elbow deep in a tub of dirty dinner plates when I heard it for the first time. My name, called clearly from somewhere in the dining room. Jake. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but it carried with perfect clarity through the kitchen noise. Every muscle in my body tensed as I remembered Rule 2. If you hear your name called from the dining room after midnight, do not respond. Do not go to investigate. Continue working and pretend you heard nothing. I forced myself to keep washing dishes, even though my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped a plate. The voice came again, more insistent this time. Jake, come here, Jake. The temptation to respond was almost overwhelming. Everything in my social conditioning screamed that ignoring someone calling my name was rude, wrong, potentially dangerous. What if it was Maria, needing my help with something? What if there was an emergency? But Trevor's scarred arm was fresh in my memory, and Danny Rivera's careful handwriting had made it clear that this rule was non-negotiable. I continued scrubbing plates, focusing on the mechanical rhythm of wash, rinse, sanitize, as the voice called my name 3 more times before finally falling silent. Good job, Trevor murmured from his position at the grill. That was a big test. The next few hours brought a steady parade of minor supernatural occurrences, each one predicted by Danny's meticulous list. The walk-in freezer door swung open at 1:47 a.m., and I dutifully closed it without looking inside, despite glimpsing something pale moving in the darkness beyond the threshold. The kitchen phone rang at 2:33 a.m. with no one on the line, and I answered according to the script before hanging up and ignoring its immediate second ring. But it was at 2:17 a.m. that I truly understood why Danny Rivera had been so specific about those 6 crucial minutes. As the digital clock on the dish machine clicked over to 2:17, the radio Trevor had been playing suddenly went silent. Not turned off, not switched to static, but completely, unnaturally silent. The dish machine stopped its constant hissing. Even the refrigeration units seemed to pause in their mechanical breathing. Following Rule 1, I immediately began talking to myself, keeping up a constant stream of chatter about anything and everything I could think of. Okay, Jake, let's see. We've got about 30 plates left in this load. Need to check the coffee cup count again. Wonder if it's going to rain tomorrow. Supposed to be partly cloudy according to the weather app. But even as I babbled, I could feel something changing in the atmosphere around me. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the shadows in the corners of the dish pit seemed to deepen and writhe. Worse, I had the distinct impression that something was listening to my nervous monologue with intense interest. At 2:19, I heard breathing that wasn't mine coming from somewhere very close by. At 2:21, I felt what could only be described as fingers brushing against the back of my neck, despite the fact that I was alone in the dish pit and standing with my back to a solid wall. At 2:22, I saw my own reflection in the chrome surface of the dish machine, but the reflection was smiling while I was not, and its eyes were completely black. I continued talking through pure force of will, maintaining the protective barrier of sound, even as every instinct told me to run, screaming from the building. When the clock finally clicked over to 2:24 and the normal sounds of the kitchen returned, I nearly collapsed from relief. Trevor appeared at my station within seconds, carrying a cup of coffee that I gratefully accepted with trembling hands. "The first time is always the worst," he said quietly. "But you did perfectly. You followed the rule exactly, and you're still here. What would have happened if I'd stopped talking?" Trevor's expression grew dark. I don't know for sure, but I think that's what it takes, people. During those 6 minutes, when the normal rules of reality don't apply here, silence gives it permission to interact more directly. The rest of the night passed without major incident, though I dutifully followed every rule on Danny's list. I checked the back door hourly, except during the forbidden 3 to 4 a.m. window, counted the coffee cups, exactly 47, and let the dish machine run through an inexplicable solo cycle at 4:15 a.m. When 6 a.m. finally arrived and the morning crew began filtering in, I felt like I had survived some kind of combat mission. The normal chatter and bustle of the day's shift felt surreal after the supernatural gauntlet of the previous 6 hours. But as I clocked out and walked to my car, I realized something that chilled me more than any of the night's supernatural encounters. I was already looking forward to coming back. Despite the fear, despite the constant tension, despite the very real danger, I felt more alive during those midnight hours at Ruby's than I had ever felt during a normal day job. Maybe that was how it started for Danny Rivera and the others who had disappeared. Maybe the diner's hold on its night shift workers wasn't entirely malevolent. Maybe it offered something, a sense of purpose, a heightened reality, a glimpse into mysteries that most people never suspected existed. As I drove home through the early morning traffic, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already changing, already becoming something different from the person who had first walked into Ruby's just 5 nights ago. The question was, would I be strong enough to follow the rules indefinitely, or would I eventually succumb to whatever temptation had claimed the others? Only time would tell, and I had a feeling that time was not entirely on my side. 3 weeks into my employment at Ruby's, I thought I had seen everything the diner's supernatural ecosystem had to offer. I had successfully navigated dozens of rule-based encounters, survived multiple 2:17 a.m. episodes, and learned to distinguish between normal electrical problems and the ominous flickering pattern that sent us fleeing to the parking lot. The night shift had become routine, in a way that any dangerous job becomes routine once you learn to manage the risks. But on my 18th night, everything changed. It started normally enough. The last regular customer left at 11:52 p.m. Maria locked the front door, and the familiar transformation began. Trevor and I settled into our respective stations, the radio playing softly in the background, the dish machine hissing its mechanical lullaby. I had just begun working through the evening's accumulation of dirty dishes when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Table 7 was occupied. I stared through the pass-through window, convinced I was seeing things. According to Rule 7, Table 7 was never to be cleaned after midnight, but nothing in Danny Rivera's meticulous list had mentioned anything about customers appearing there spontaneously. Yet there she was, an elderly woman in a faded blue dress, sitting perfectly still with her hands folded on the table, staring straight ahead with eyes that reflected the fluorescent lighting like polished stones. "Trevor," I called quietly, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Look at Table 7. Trevor glanced up from his prep work, followed my gaze through the window, and went completely white. "Oh fuck. Oh no. What? What is it?" Instead of answering, Trevor quickly turned off his radio and began gathering his belongings. "We need to get Maria. Right now." We found Maria in her office, going over inventory sheets with the same methodical concentration she applied to everything. When Trevor explained what we had seen, her pen stopped moving mid-calculation, and she closed her eyes with an expression of profound weariness. "How long has she been there?" Maria asked. "We just noticed her, maybe 2 minutes ago," I replied. "But Maria, how did she get in?" "The doors are locked, and we've been in the kitchen the whole time." Maria stood slowly, like someone carrying a great weight. "She doesn't use doors, Jake. Come with me, both of you. And remember, whatever happens, be polite, be respectful, and follow my lead exactly." We walked through the kitchen toward the dining room, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. As we got closer, I could see more details about our impossible customer. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pinned back in an old-fashioned style. Her blue dress looked like something from the 1940s, and her hands, still folded motionless on the table, wore simple rings that caught the light strangely. What disturbed me most was her absolute stillness. She didn't fidget, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. She was like a photograph of a person rather than an actual living being. Maria approached table 7 with the practiced professionalism of someone who had done this before. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to Ruby's. What can I get for you tonight?" The woman's head turned toward Maria with mechanical precision, and when she spoke, her voice had the quality of old recordings played through damaged speakers. "Coffee, please. Black, and a slice of apple pie." "Of course. Coming right up." Maria gestured for us to follow her back to the kitchen, where she immediately began preparing the order with movements that were both efficient and ritualistic. She selected a specific coffee cup from the rack, one I hadn't noticed before, slightly different from the others, with a hairline crack running down one side. The coffee she poured was from a pot that had been sitting on a back burner, thick and dark as motor oil. "That coffee's been sitting there for hours," I whispered. "It'll taste terrible." "She doesn't taste it the way we do," Maria replied quietly, cutting a slice of pie from a dessert case I could have sworn was empty moments before. "And Jake, this is very important. When we serve her, you count to 30 after she takes her first sip of coffee. When you reach 30, you go back to the dish pit, and you don't look at table 7 again until morning. Do you understand?" "I don't understand any of this. Who is she? How did she get in here?" Maria balanced the coffee and pie on a tray with practiced ease. "Her name was Eleanor Hutchins. She worked the night shift here from 1962 to 1967. She died at this table on March 15th, 1967, during her dinner break." Trevor had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Heart attack. She was alone in the diner, working a solo shift because the other waitress had called in sick. By the time the morning crew found her, she had been dead for hours. Since then," Maria continued, "Eleanor appears at table 7 approximately once every 2 to 3 weeks. Always between midnight and 3 a.m., always ordering the same thing. We serve her, we wait for her to finish, and then she leaves the same way she arrived. But why isn't this in Danny's rules?" I asked. Maria's expression grew darker. "Because Danny tried to interact with her beyond the basic service protocol. He thought he could communicate with her, maybe help her move on to whatever comes after. The night before he disappeared, he sat down at table 7 and tried to have a conversation. We returned to the dining room, where Eleanor sat exactly as we had left her, motionless and patient. Maria placed the coffee and pie in front of her with the same careful service she would provide any living customer. "Thank you, dear," Eleanor said, her voice maintaining that strange, recorded quality. She lifted the coffee cup with movements that seemed slightly out of sync with reality, as if she were operating under different physical laws than the rest of us. I watched, fascinated despite my terror, as she took her first sip. The coffee was steaming hot, but she showed no reaction to the temperature. Instead, she smiled slightly, the first change in her expression since we had noticed her presence. That was when I started counting. 1, 2, 3. Eleanor took another sip, then picked up her fork and began eating the pie with small, precise bites. Everything about her movements had that same mechanical quality, as if she were following a script that had been written decades ago. 15, 16, 17. "She's beautiful," I whispered, and immediately regretted it. There was something beautiful about Eleanor, but it was the terrible beauty of preserved things, of flowers pressed between pages of old books, of photographs that captured moments that would never come again. 25, 26, 27. Eleanor looked directly at me, and I saw that her eyes were not reflecting the fluorescent lights as I'd thought. They were generating their own illumination, a soft blue glow that seemed to come from somewhere infinitely deep and impossibly far away. 28, 29, 30. I forced myself to turn away and return to the dish pit, but I could feel Eleanor's glowing eyes following me until I was out of sight. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the dishes I was supposed to be washing. "First time seeing one of the regulars?" Trevor asked, appearing at my station with studied casualness. "One of the regulars? There are others. Eleanor's the most common, but there are 3 others who show up occasionally. There's William, a truck driver who died in a crash right outside the diner in 1979. He orders coffee and a burger, rare, and he always leaves exact change on the table. Coins for 1979. Then there's Rebecca, a young woman who overdosed in the bathroom in 1995. She doesn't eat anything, just sits at booth 3 and cries silently until dawn. I felt sick. How many people have died here? More than you'd think for a roadside diner, Trevor replied grimly. But the thing is, Jake, not everyone who dies here becomes a regular. It's like something about this place attracts certain kinds of spirits, certain kinds of unfinished business. What about the fourth one? Trevor's expression grew troubled. The fourth one is different. His name was Robert Chun, and he didn't die here. He was a night shift dishwasher, like you, who disappeared about 8 years ago. But now he comes back sometimes, always between 4 and 5 a.m., always looking for something he can never find. A chill ran down my spine as I processed this information. Trevor, what if the people who disappeared don't actually leave? What if they become part of whatever this place is? Before Trevor could answer, we heard the sound of a chair being pushed back from table 7. Through the pass-through window, I could see Eleanor standing, her meal apparently finished. She walked toward the front door with that same mechanical gait, and I watched in amazement as she passed directly through the locked glass without opening it. Maria appeared a moment later, carrying a bus tub to clean table 7. The coffee cup was empty, the pie plate scraped clean, and sitting next to them was a dollar bill so old and worn it looked like it might crumble at a touch. Payment in full, Maria said, pocketing the ancient currency. She always tips exactly 15% based on 1967 prices. As I watched Maria clean the table with the same ritual care she had shown in preparing Eleanor's order, I realized that the night shift at Ruby's was far more complex than Danny Rivera's rules had indicated. The rules were just the basic survival protocol, the minimum requirements for avoiding disaster. But there was an entire hidden ecosystem operating in the diner after midnight, a community of the living and the dead that had developed its own customs, its own economy, its own delicate balance. How long has this been going on? I asked Maria as she finished cleaning. Longer than I've worked here. Longer than Ruby's has been Ruby's, probably. The building has housed restaurants since the 1940s, and I suspect the phenomena predate even that. This might have been a boarding house or a travel stop before it became a diner. But why do they come here? What draws them to this place? Maria paused in her cleaning, looking around the empty dining room with an expression that mixed sadness and acceptance. I think it's because this is a liminal space, Jake. A place between destinations, between day and night, between the living world and whatever comes after. People pass through here during the most vulnerable hours, when they're tired, when they're alone, when they're most open to other possibilities. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I found myself thinking obsessively about Eleanor and the other midnight patrons. When Robert Chun appeared at 4:23 a.m., looking exactly like a living person until you noticed that he cast no reflection in the chrome surfaces of the kitchen equipment, I served him coffee with the same respectful efficiency Maria had shown Eleanor. Robert spoke to me, which apparently was unusual. "Have you seen my time card?" he asked, his voice carrying the same recorded quality as Eleanor's. "I can't find my time card, and my shift isn't over yet." "Your shift ended a long time ago, Robert," I replied gently, following Maria's whispered instructions. "You can rest now." He looked confused for a moment, then smiled sadly and walked toward the back door, disappearing through the solid wood without opening it. As dawn approached and the morning crew began to arrive, I realized that my understanding of Ruby's all-night diner had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just a workplace with unusual rules and supernatural hazards. It was a way station for lost souls, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, were thin enough to allow for impossible encounters. And I was beginning to suspect that my role as night shift dishwasher involved more than just washing dishes and following safety protocols. I was becoming part of something larger, something that stretched back decades and would likely continue long after I was gone. The question was, would I choose to leave while I still could, or would I allow myself to be drawn deeper into Ruby's midnight world, with all the dangers and revelations that path might hold? 6 weeks into my employment at Ruby's, I had become something I no longer recognized. The man who had started washing dishes for $15 an hour was gone, replaced by someone who could serve coffee to the dead, navigate supernatural phenomena with practiced ease, and sleep peacefully during the day despite having witnessed things that should have driven him to madness. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, like being slowly absorbed into the diner's nocturnal ecosystem. I found myself looking forward to Eleanor's visits, anticipating the specific needs of each midnight patron, even developing a strange affection for the 6-minute periods of supernatural intensity that had once terrified me beyond words. But it was on my 42nd night that I finally understood the true price of working at Ruby's all-night diner. I was cleaning the coffee station around 3 a.m. when I noticed something that made me freeze in place. Reflected in the chrome surface of the coffee machine, I could see my own face, but something was wrong with it. My reflection's eyes had the same subtle glow I had noticed in Eleanor's, a soft luminescence that seemed to come from somewhere deep behind the pupils. I turned away from the coffee machine and looked at myself in the restroom mirror. In the harsh fluorescent light, my eyes appeared normal, tired but human. But when I returned to the kitchen and glanced again at the chrome surfaces, the glow was still there, unmistakable and growing stronger. "Trevor," I called quietly, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Come look at this." Trevor approached the coffee station, glanced at my reflection in the chrome, and his face went completely white. "How long has this been happening?" "I just noticed it tonight, but..." I paused, thinking back over the past few weeks. "I've been feeling different, like I'm more connected to this place, more attuned to the rhythms of a night shift." "Jake, we need to talk to Maria. Right now." We found Maria in her office, but she took one look at my face and immediately set down her paperwork. "Show me your hands, Jake." I held out my hands, palms up, not sure what she was looking for. In the office's dim lighting, they looked normal enough, though perhaps slightly paler than usual. But Maria pulled out a small UV flashlight from her desk drawer, and when she shined it on my palms, we all saw the problem. Under ultraviolet light, my skin showed a faint network of dark lines like veins or roots spreading from my fingertips toward my wrists. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity, but there was something deeply wrong about seeing it mapped across my flesh. "How far up do they go?" Maria asked quietly. I rolled up my sleeves, and we traced the dark lines all the way to my shoulders. They were everywhere the UV light touched, creating an intricate web beneath my skin that seemed to pulse with its own subtle rhythm. "What is this?" I whispered, staring at the alien patterns covering my arms. Maria turned off the UV light and sat down heavily in her desk chair. "It's what happens when you work here too long, Jake. When you become too integrated with whatever exists in this place after midnight." Am I dying?" "Not dying exactly, but you're changing, becoming something else. Something that belongs more to Ruby's midnight world than to the daylight world outside." Trevor had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Show him Robert's file, Maria." Maria opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Chun, Robert, Personnel. Inside were all the usual employment documents, application, tax forms, schedule sheets. But there were also photographs, and when Maria spread them across her desk, I understood why Trevor had gone silent. The first photograph showed Robertson on his first day of work, a young man who looked remarkably similar to me. Average height, dark hair, serious expression. He looked completely normal, completely human. But the subsequent photographs, taken at weekly intervals, showed a gradual transformation that mirrored what was happening to me. By the 4th week, Robert's eyes had begun to show that subtle glow. By the 8th week, his skin had taken on an unusual pallor. By the 12th week, the photograph seemed slightly out of focus, as if Robert was existing in a different visual plane than the camera could properly capture. The final photograph in the series was dated 3 days before Robert's disappearance. In it, he was barely visible at all, more suggestion than substance, like a double exposure or a ghost image superimposed on the film. "This is what happened to Danny Rivera too," Maria explained, "and to Miguel Santos before him. They didn't just disappear, Jake. They transformed, gradually losing their connection to the physical world and becoming part of Ruby's supernatural ecosystem." I stared at the photographs, seeing my own future laid out in gradual stages. "How long do I have?" "Based on the progression we've documented, maybe 2 more weeks before you reach the point of no return." The words hit me like a physical blow. Point of no return. The point where you can no longer exist in the daylight world at all. Where Ruby's becomes your entire reality, and you join the ranks of our midnight patrons permanently. I felt like I was drowning, like the air in the small office had become too thick to breathe. But there has to be a way to stop it, to reverse what's happening. Maria and Trevor exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. They had tried to save the others, and they had failed. There might be one option, Maria said finally, but it's dangerous, and there's no guarantee it will work. Tell me, you have to break the primary rule, the one that supersedes all others. You have to spend a full night shift in the diner completely alone, without following any of the protective protocols. If the transformation process can be reversed, that level of direct exposure to whatever exists here might shock your system back to normal. And if it doesn't work, then you disappear completely, like the others. Or worse, you become something hostile to the living staff, something we'd have to find a way to contain. I looked down at my hands, knowing that the dark network was spreading beneath my skin even as we spoke. The thought of becoming like Eleanor or Robert, trapped forever in a single location, reliving the same patterns for eternity, filled me with a terror deeper than any I had experienced during my nights at Ruby's. When? I asked. Tomorrow night. I'll give the morning crew a cover story. Tell them you called in sick. Trevor will stay away as well. You'll have the diner to yourself from midnight until dawn. The next day passed in a blur of preparation and growing dread. I called my sister, my parents, a few close friends, saying goodbye in ways they wouldn't understand until much later. I wrote letters explaining everything that had happened, sealing them in envelopes to be delivered if I didn't survive the night. As the sun set, and I prepared to drive to Ruby's for what might be my final shift, I caught myself in the bathroom mirror one last time. My reflection looked almost normal, but when I turned my head just right, I could see the faint glow beginning to emanate from my eyes, even without the chrome surface to reveal it. I was running out of time. Ruby's looked different as I approached it alone that night. Without the usual flow of late-night customers and the familiar presence of Trevor and Maria, the diner seemed smaller somehow, more concentrated in its strangeness. The neon signs buzzed with unusual intensity, and the parking lot lights cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any physical objects. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, immediately feeling the weight of absolute solitude. The silence was profound, not just the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. I made my way to the dish pit and began my usual routine, but without the protective structure of Danny Rivera's rules, everything felt different, more immediate, more dangerous. It was like working without safety equipment in a hazardous environment, every moment filled with potential catastrophe. At 12:47 a.m., my name was called from the dining room. Instead of ignoring it as Rule 2 demanded, I walked through the kitchen and into the empty restaurant. "Hello." I called back. "Who's there?" The response came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices I recognized from weeks of midnight encounters. Eleanor, Robert, William, Rebecca, and others I had never met. Voices from decades of night shifts, decades of workers who had been absorbed into Ruby's supernatural ecosystem. "Join us, Jake," they said in unison. "It's so much easier to just let go." I felt the pull of their invitation, the seductive promise of release from the burden of existing in both worlds. But I also felt something else, a fierce determination to reclaim my humanity, to break free from the diner's hold before it was too late. "No," I said firmly, "I'm not ready to join you." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and the lights throughout the diner began flickering in patterns I had never seen before. But instead of fleeing to the parking lot as the rules demanded, I stood my ground in the center of the dining room. "I know what you are," I said to the empty air. "You're not malevolent, exactly. You're just hungry. Hungry for connection, for purpose, for the warmth of human consciousness. But you can't have mine. Not yet." The supernatural response was immediate and overwhelming. Every chair in the dining room moved at once, scraping across the floor in a cacophony of protest. The jukebox began playing songs that had never been programmed into it, sad ballads from decades past sung by voices that were no longer entirely human. The temperature continued dropping until I could see my breath, and frost began forming on the windows despite the Florida heat outside. But through it all, I remained standing in the center of the storm, refusing to give in to the fear that had controlled me for so many weeks. This was my test, my final opportunity to choose between two worlds. At 2:17 a.m., the 6-minute window arrived with unprecedented intensity. The dish pit filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source, and I could hear the sound of dishes being washed by invisible hands. But instead of talking to protect myself, I walked directly into the supernatural maelstrom. The shadows enveloped me immediately, and I felt the full weight of Ruby's nocturnal consciousness pressing against my mind. I saw flashes of everyone who had worked the night shift over the decades, felt their exhaustion and loneliness and gradual surrender to the diner's seductive embrace. I understood, in that moment, that the transformation process wasn't a punishment or an attack. It was an offer of belonging, of permanent community with others who had found a regular world too harsh and demanding. But I also felt something the others hadn't, a fierce connection to the daylight world I would be leaving behind. My sister's laughter, the smell of Florida rain, the simple pleasure of sleeping in my own bed while sunlight streamed through the windows. These memories formed a lifeline back to my humanity, and I grabbed onto them with desperate strength. I choose the living world, I said aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the supernatural atmosphere. I choose to remain human. The response was a sound like breaking glass multiplied 1,000-fold, and suddenly I was alone in the dish pit, surrounded by normal lighting and ordinary shadows. The clock read 2:24 a.m., and the only sound was the familiar hiss of the dish machine. I looked at my hands and the chrome surface of the coffee machine. No glow emanated from my eyes. I rolled up my sleeves and examined my arms under the UV light I had brought from Maria's office. The dark network beneath my skin was gone, leaving only normal human flesh. The rest of the night passed quietly, almost peacefully. None of the midnight patrons appeared, and the supernatural phenomena that had become so familiar were conspicuously absent. It was as if Ruby's was giving me space to readjust, to remember what it felt like to be fully human again. When Maria and Trevor arrived at 6 a.m., they found me sitting at the counter, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise through the front windows. "Jake," Maria called tentatively. "Are you yourself?" I turned to face them, and I saw relief flood their expressions as they recognized something in my eyes that had been missing for weeks. "I'm myself," I confirmed. "I'm human, and I'm quitting effective immediately." I worked one final shift that night, training my replacement and saying goodbye to the supernatural community that had nearly claimed me. Eleanor appeared one last time, and when she looked at me with those glowing eyes, there was something that might have been approval in her expression. "You chose well," she said in her recorded voice. "Not everyone is strong enough to leave." As I drove away from Ruby's all-night diner for the last time, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just another neon glow in the Florida darkness, I felt a mixture of loss and liberation. I had escaped the diner's hold, but I had also lost something precious, a connection to mysteries that most people never even suspected existed. 6 months later, I'm working a normal day job in Orlando, living a perfectly ordinary life. But sometimes, usually around 2:17 a.m., when I'm lying awake in my apartment, I think about Ruby's and wonder about the new dishwasher who has undoubtedly taken my place. I wonder if he's learning to follow Danny Rivera's rules, if he's serving coffee to Eleanor and the other midnight patrons, if he's feeling the gradual pull of transformation. And sometimes, despite everything I went through, despite the terror and the very real danger I faced, I find myself missing those nights when the boundary between worlds grew thin and anything seemed possible. There was a beauty in that darkness, a terrible and wonderful truth about the nature of reality that most people never get to glimpse. But I'm glad I chose to remain human. I'm glad I found the strength to walk away from Ruby's before it was too late. Because while the midnight world offers its own form of immortality, its own kind of purpose, it comes at the cost of everything that makes us truly alive. The diner is still there, still operating 24 hours a day, still hiring night shift dishwashers who think they're just taking an ordinary job for decent pay. And somewhere in that dish pit, following rules that protect them from dangers they can barely comprehend, Another lost soul is learning that some places in this world exist at the intersection of reality and nightmare. I just pray they're strong enough to leave before they become another midnight patron, forever trapped in Ruby's eternal night shift, washing dishes that will never truly come clean.